Racist judge thinks he's about to sentence a black boy until he says two words that stop him cold. The sun filtered through the dusty windows of the county courthouse, casting a pale, gold-tinged glow across the cold marble floor. Time seemed slower inside those walls, like the building itself had grown tired of hearing the same cries for justice fall on deaf ears. Outside, a few reporters loitered half-heartedly near the entrance, yawning between glances at their phones. It was just another morning in a forgotten corner of the judicial system. Nothing remarkable was expected. No cameras inside, no family members crying out. Just a 16-year-old black boy sitting in silence while the machinery of assumption churned forward, greased by indifference. Isaiah Carter sat at the defense table, wrists bound by a pair of dull silver handcuffs that bit lightly into his skin every time he shifted. He didn't move much. His gaze was fixed somewhere near the base of the judge's bench, not looking directly at anyone. Not because he was afraid, but because looking up meant seeing their eyes. And their eyes always looked the same. Cold, rehearsed, pre-decided. This wasn't his first time inside a courtroom, but it felt like the final time. Like this was the one where they wouldn't even pretend to consider the truth. Just nod, stamp, and send him away. He'd seen this play before. He had lived inside its shadow his entire life. Raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were more familiar than lullabies, Isaiah learned early that the rules were different for kids like him. His father, Thomas Carter, had done everything right. 2 jobs, clean record, bills paid even if it meant skipped meals, and still, they were 1 paycheck away from being another eviction notice. But what the world never understood was that Thomas gave Isaiah more than food or a roof. He gave him stories, bedtime tales of warriors and kings who held their heads high, even when the world tried to crush them. He taught his son that dignity wasn't something given. It was something you chose to carry. And Isaiah carried it. Every day. Even here, in this place where justice wore a crooked face and truth often died before it reached the witness stand. His orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his lean frame, a symbol of presumed guilt. His hair was neatly braided, a quiet act of resistance his father insisted on the night before. If they were going to judge his son, Thomas said, let them judge a boy who looked like he came from love. Isaiah hadn't spoken much that morning. There was nothing left to say. The public defender had barely glanced at him since they arrived. A tired man with a cluttered briefcase and the defeated posture of someone who had long since stopped believing he could win anything that mattered. Across the aisle stood the prosecutor, clean-cut, slick-haired, and confident. The kind of man who could turn an empty grocery bag into evidence if the jury looked bored enough. He spoke in long, steady bursts, painting Isaiah as a ticking time bomb, a troubled youth with a record of defiance, a lack of discipline, a product of the system's failure. He referenced a previous school suspension without context. He used words like pattern and escalation, without ever mentioning that Isaiah had never been convicted of a crime. It didn't matter. The courtroom nodded along, not with their heads, but with their silence. The judge didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood their roles. Judge Richard Hallwell sat high above them, the wooden bench casting shadows that made his already severe face appear carved from stone. He rarely blinked, rarely spoke more than necessary. His reputation preceded him, strict, unsympathetic, and known for meting out maximum sentences, particularly to defendants who couldn't afford decent representation. Some whispered that his rulings were guided less by law and more by personal disdain, but no one ever challenged him. Not seriously, not here. Not in a county where his name was etched into legal directories like scripture. To Isaiah, the judge's presence didn't inspire fear. It simply confirmed what he already knew. Fairness was not invited into this room. The alleged crime was a convenience store break-in 2 weeks prior. Isaiah was accused of smashing a glass door and stealing cigarettes and cash from the register. The problem was, there were no fingerprints, none matching Isaiah's anyway. The security footage had gone missing. Technical malfunction was the explanation. A single witness claimed to have seen a boy running from the scene, but their description was vague. Black, about 6 feet, maybe younger. That could have described half of Isaiah's school. He had no criminal record, no stolen goods in his possession, and had been found 2 blocks away walking home from the library. But none of that seemed to matter. Not to the prosecution, not to the judge, and certainly not to the system that had long ago written boys like Isaiah into the margins. As the prosecutor continued, each word felt like another stone thrown into a well that had no bottom. Isaiah sat still, his pulse steady but his chest tight. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was exhausted, not just from this trial but from the years that led up to it. The teachers who looked through him, the store clerks who followed him, the neighbors who flinched when he walked too close. Every slight had prepared him for this moment, taught him how to wear stillness like armor. But beneath that quiet was a fire, low, steady, and patient. It wasn't the kind that burned buildings. It was the kind that waited for truth, waited for a voice. He thought of his father, thought of that quiet moment 2 nights ago when Thomas had sat beside him in the holding cell, hand on his shoulder. "You remember who you are," his father had said, not as a command but as a reminder. Not who they say you are, who you are. That memory was more real than anything in this courtroom. It kept Isaiah's back straight, his jaw firm, even as the prosecutor's words tried to erode whatever dignity he had left. He didn't interrupt, didn't plead. He just watched, waited. The public defender finally rose, but there was no passion in his tone, no thunder, no fight. He mentioned the lack of evidence, the unclear timeline, and then quickly rested the case like he had somewhere else to be. Isaiah didn't expect more from him. This man had 20 clients and 3 courtrooms to juggle before lunch. Justice didn't move in this system. It flickered. And Isaiah had learned to survive in flickers. The judge scribbled something on a notepad. His eyes never lifted. A bailiff yawned near the door. The room had settled into a rhythm, one that hummed with the quiet certainty of a decision already made. Isaiah was supposed to play his part. To beg, to stumble over apologies, to plead for mercy he didn't deserve to need. That was how it usually went. But he remained still. His silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate. It filled the room with something the others hadn't expected, presence. Not loud, not disruptive, just undeniable. Somewhere in the back, one of the reporters leaned forward, sensing something. Not a story yet, but a shift. Isaiah's stillness wasn't fear, it was restraint. The prosecutor, done with his performance, sat down with a satisfied nod, already thinking of the next case. The judge looked up for the first time, eyes scanning Isaiah like someone reading a file for flaws. The gavel rested just inches from his hand. In his mind, the sentence was already forming, months, maybe a year. Enough to send a message, enough to be forgotten by the next docket. But Isaiah didn't blink. He didn't flinch. And though no one had asked him to speak, though the world expected him to fold beneath the weight of assumption, he inhaled. A slow, calm breath, the kind his father had taught him to take when everything around him screamed chaos. He held it, not in his lungs but in his bones, because he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The courtroom, though technically still in motion, felt paused, like time was waiting to see what Isaiah Carter would do next. In the weeks before the courtroom's silence and the weight of metal around his wrists, Isaiah Carter's world was far from calm, but it was his. The cramped apartment on the south side, with its peeling wallpaper and overworked heater, pulsed with life, laughter, and struggle. The living room doubled as a study hall, a playground, and sometimes a battlefield between 2 brothers arguing over the last piece of toast. Isaiah knew every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the ceiling, and every rhythm of his father's tired footsteps. Thomas Carter was up before the sun and home long after it set, eyes weary, hands rough with engine grease, but his heart always full when it came to his boys. He didn't have much, but he had love, discipline, and purpose. That was the legacy he wanted to pass down. Isaiah absorbed it all, not with rebellion, but with reverence. He listened closely to the wisdom slipped into bedtime stories, to lessons woven through dinner conversations. His father didn't preach. He prepared. The neighborhood had its dangers, flashing sirens, boarded-up windows, and the buzz of rumors that traveled faster than buses. But there was also community. Isaiah could walk past Miss Geraldine's porch and be handed a warm biscuit without a word. He could cut through the playground and see Coach Briggs yelling at kids to run harder, think smarter. Life was layered, not easy, but not hopeless. Isaiah had learned to navigate it with care. He kept his head down, his grades up, and his brother out of trouble. Malik, just 10, was bright-eyed and curious, always one step behind Isaiah, asking questions about the world and what came after cartoons and cereal. Isaiah didn't mind. He took it as his mission, to be the kind of role model his father was trying to be in double shifts and exhausted hugs. School was Isaiah's sanctuary. He wasn't the loudest in class, but his teachers noticed the quiet fire in him. He wrote essays with force, debated constitutional law with nuance, and always stayed after class to ask for more reading. He had a thing for history, especially courtroom battles. His favorite story wasn't from a textbook. It was the one his father told him, about a black attorney who defended wrongly accused men in the Deep South, a man who stood tall even as judges sneered and juries whispered. Isaiah wanted to be that man. He wanted to be the line that stood between truth and assumption. His acceptance into the summer law program had been the proudest moment in the Carter household. Thomas framed the letter and taped it on the fridge like it was a championship trophy. For once, the future seemed clear, like a road not yet cracked by potholes or blocked by detours. But nothing in Isaiah's world stayed still for long. Trouble brewed quietly, like a storm rolling in behind blue skies. A local gang had started pressing their influence further down the block, offering money, protection, or threats depending on the day. Most kids learned to look away. Isaiah couldn't. He wasn't built that way. When his friend Khalil got cornered outside a corner store by two of the gang's younger recruits, Isaiah stepped in. He didn't throw punches. He used his voice. His presence was enough to scatter them, but the damage was done. Eyes had noticed. Word spread. Standing up had made him a target. Days passed. Isaiah went on with life. Books, homework, basketball with Malik in the alley behind their building. But there was a shift. Whispers trailed him in the hallway. A teacher once called him into the office just to ask if everything was all right at home. Something was building. He could feel it, but couldn't name it. Then came the night the corner store was robbed. The same store. The same place where he'd stood tall. He wasn't there that night. He had been home, helping Malik with math and later dozing off to a documentary with his father. No one asked. No one checked. It started with a knock at school. Not even a knock, really. More like a ripple of motion in the hallway. 2 officers walked in during third period. No explanation. Just firm hands on Isaiah's shoulders and eyes filled with suspicion. The teacher stammered something. The class fell into a stunned silence. Isaiah didn't resist. He kept his head high, even as whispers multiplied like wildfire behind him. No one read him his rights. No one asked if there was a parent to call. They just led him away. Cold air, cold cuffs, and the colder stares of people who had never known him beyond the color of his skin and the assumptions it carried. The interrogation room was small and smelled of mildew. They told him they had a witness. They told him he'd been seen on camera. They didn't mention that the tape was grainy, that the timestamp was off, or that he had been there a whole 48 hours before the incident. That didn't matter. His presence was all the confirmation they needed. The detective leaned forward like he was giving advice, not accusations. Isaiah held firm. He repeated the truth. He hadn't been there. He was home. His father could confirm it. Malik, too. But the system didn't want truth. It wanted a confession. And when it didn't get one, it settled for constructing a version of the story that fit the picture in their heads. A black boy, a recordless store, a shaky witness who had been known to trade lies for favors. Thomas arrived at the station furious, demanding to speak to his son, demanding answers. They gave him none. Hours passed before they allowed Isaiah to see him. Their conversation was brief, punctuated by exhaustion and disbelief. Thomas saw in his son the same calm he had trained into him, but it broke something in him to know it was being tested like this. He knew what came next. Bail hearings, court dates, evidence that vanished. Stories twisted by the time they reached the judge's bench. He had fought for this country, served on ships in hostile waters, fixed engines in 110-degree heat. And now his son was being treated like a threat for being brave in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back at home, Malik asked questions with wide, frightened eyes. Thomas answered as best as he could. But how did you explain to a child that justice didn't always look like the stories on TV? How did you explain that doing the right thing didn't always protect you? Isaiah's room sat untouched, his textbook still open to the last chapter he'd read. The scholarship letter remained on the fridge, mocking them with its promise. Thomas sat in the dark that night, the TV flickering soundlessly in the background, and wondered how much fight one man was supposed to give before the world gave something back. Meanwhile, Isaiah sat in a holding cell, counting the bricks in the wall. He refused to let himself break. He remembered his father's words, "Stand tall, even when the world tries to bend you." But the isolation clawed at him. The noise of others pacing, shouting, crying, it all bled into a kind of quiet madness. He recited court cases in his head, imagined arguments he would make if given the chance. He thought about Khalil. He wondered if his silence was fear or betrayal. He didn't blame him. The stakes were always higher for them. He just wanted a chance, a real chance, to speak, to be heard, to not be dismissed before he even opened his mouth. When the public defender came to visit, Isaiah noticed the man didn't bring notes. He asked a few questions, nodded without really listening, and said something vague about how things might move fast. Isaiah didn't feel hope in that. He felt a tightening of the noose. He knew what a rushed defense meant. He knew how easily names became numbers, how quickly lives were labeled as problems and filed away. He sat back on the bench, jaw clenched, heart steady. This wasn't the end. Not yet. He just needed a moment. One crack in the wall. One breath of truth in a room full of doubt. He didn't know when it would come, but he believed it would. And until then, he would wait, with fire in his chest and his father's voice echoing in his ears. At the Juvenile Holding Center, Isaiah Carter quickly learned that justice in the real world came fractured, its promises hollow and its cracks too wide to count. There were no comforting faces, no second chances, and certainly no assumption of innocence. The moment he was processed, his name became a number. His voice drowned beneath the machinery of a system that operated less like a pursuit of truth and more like an assembly line of assumptions. From the start, he was isolated, not for punishment, they told him, but for his protection. A cold room with dim lights, a metal bench, and a toilet in the corner became his reality. No other boys around, no laughter or shouting, just silence that pressed in on him like walls slowly moving inward. They didn't say why he needed protection. He could guess. Maybe it was because he was different, not just by the charge pinned to his name, but by the way he held himself, the way he refused to shrink. Or maybe it was because they feared what would happen if he was placed among others who might have already heard the rumors, already seen the news. In a system where even whispers could be weaponized, it was safer, for them, not to risk it. Still, the isolation chipped away at him. The minutes stretched longer. The days blended together. Meals came through a slot in the door. Lights flicked on and off according to rules he was never told, and every knock made his heart pound because it meant more questions. The interrogations weren't like what he'd seen on TV. There was no lawyer, no parent, just two officers in plain clothes who acted friendly enough at first. They brought in files, whispered to each other, and then leaned forward like they were having a conversation. They said things could go easier if he admitted what he'd done. They said everyone makes mistakes, even good kids, that denying it would just make things harder. They asked him again and again, what happened at the store, who was with him, why he ran. Isaiah sat still, his eyes steady, his voice unshaken. He told them the truth every time. He wasn't there. He was at home. He even named the movie he watched, the homework he helped Malik with. But they didn't write that down. They only wrote when he paused, when he looked away for a second too long. They twisted high. Outside, Thomas Carter was fighting a war that most fathers wouldn't be strong enough to face. The day after Isaiah was taken, he had gone straight to the precinct, demanding answers no one wanted to give. He was told to wait, then told to leave, then told to wait again. He didn't. He made calls, lawyers, veterans he'd served with, anyone who might know someone who could help. He found an attorney through an old friend, someone who had handled cases like Isaiah's before. But the court moved fast, faster than he'd anticipated. Before the ink had dried on the retainer agreement, a public defender had already been assigned. That's when Thomas realized what he was up against. The process wasn't just flawed, it was designed to be fast, not fair. The public defender, a thin man with sunken eyes and a briefcase full of unopened files, visited Isaiah once. He skimmed the report, nodded occasionally, and told Isaiah to keep his answers short during the hearing. He didn't ask for an alibi. He didn't ask for witnesses. He didn't even seem surprised when Isaiah insisted he was innocent. To him, Isaiah was just another name on a docket, another case to wrap up before the week was out. When Thomas finally made it to court with their hired attorney, paperwork in hand, the judge had already refused the switch, citing procedural timelines. The defender would stay. The court wanted no delays. Efficiency was the priority. Judge Hallwell presided over the courtroom like a man made of stone. His reputation preceded him. Cold, methodical, a stickler for rules that always seemed to favor one side. 3 decades on the bench, and his record painted a grim portrait. Those who studied his cases knew the pattern. Black and Latino boys received sentences nearly double those of their white peers. He had never been publicly called a racist, but that was the genius of it. His decisions weren't loud or overt. They were couched in legal language, cloaked in technicalities, hidden behind a robe and a gavel. In court, he didn't shout. He didn't sneer. He just decided. And his decisions left scars. When Isaiah first stood before him, shackled and wearing the standard-issue tan jumpsuit, the judge barely looked up. He reviewed the report, glanced at the file, then asked procedural questions without emotion. The prosecutor, a young assistant DA, presented the case as if it were airtight. A grainy security video, never mind the timestamp inconsistencies. A witness, never mind that he was a known informant with a history of false statements. A pattern of behavior, though Isaiah had no record. No one mentioned his grades, his scholarship offer, his dreams. No one asked about the essay he wrote on civil liberties just weeks before. In the courtroom, none of that mattered. He wasn't a boy. He was a suspect, and that made all the difference. Thomas sat in the gallery, his fists clenched, heart pounding as he watched his son treated like a criminal without a trial. He tried to interject once, stood to speak out when Isaiah was accused of resisting arrest, but the bailiff's hand was already on his shoulder, forcing him back into his seat. He filed motions, wrote letters, cited precedents that the judge ignored. He started looking deeper, pulling public records, reaching out to law students and advocates. He found articles that hinted at bias, found names of families with similar stories. But that kind of evidence took time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. The hearings moved like clockwork. One after another, decisions were made, motions denied, evidence excluded, witnesses deemed unreliable, all of it pointing in one direction. Isaiah's voice, each time he spoke, was measured and firm. But the courtroom wasn't listening. It was moving, and in that movement, truth was trampled. Days before the final hearing, Thomas found a case from 5 years earlier, another black teen accused in the same courtroom, sentenced heavily on flimsy evidence. Same judge, similar charges, same outcome. He printed it, highlighted inconsistencies, added it to the stack he was building. He even managed to get a civil rights group interested. They told him they'd look into it, maybe send someone to observe. But they couldn't promise anything, not in time. Isaiah felt the shift too. Something cold settled in his chest each night. The reality of the system he once dreamed of working in now loomed like a monster behind bars. He kept his mind sharp, replaying constitutional clauses, thinking about appeals, clinging to facts. But he was still a 16-year-old boy, alone, and the silence was getting louder. On the day of the final hearing, he was awakened before sunrise. The guard didn't speak as he led him down the hallway, just unlocked doors, and guided him toward a van. Rain pelted the windows on the way. He stared at the sky, thinking how unfair it was that it cried more for him than the people meant to protect him. In the courtroom, his father sat in the same place, the folder of evidence on his lap like a shield. The public defender checked his phone. The prosecutor straightened her jacket. Judge Hallwell entered without ceremony. One decision, one sentence. Isaiah stood, hands cuffed in front of him. His name was read, his charge repeated. The judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing. Isaiah lifted his chin. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He said he was innocent, that he had an alibi, that he was being punished for something he didn't do. Judge Hallwell didn't flinch. He reviewed the papers, paused, then issued his ruling. Detainment, extended, evaluation pending, no release. Thomas closed his eyes, heart sinking. Isaiah stood still, even as the bailiff moved to escort him away. No miracle came, just silence. The fight wasn't over, but the damage had been done, and the cracks in justice had claimed another truth. On the eve of the sentencing, Isaiah sat on the cold slab of his cell bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if the answers were etched between the cracks in the plaster. The light above him flickered softly, casting long, stretched shadows across the floor, a haunting metronome counting down the hours. He wasn't angry anymore. That emotion had burned itself out somewhere between the fourth sleepless night and the second denied motion. What remained now was something quieter. He was just tired. Tired of fighting invisible hands. Tired of being judged without being known. Tired of wearing the weight of suspicion like a second skin. He had followed every rule they gave him, answered every question with honesty, kept his head down, waited, hoped. But each time he extended a hand toward fairness, the system seemed to pull farther away, an illusion of justice on a string, always out of reach. His father had promised him things would change, that the truth had a way of pushing through. But Isaiah was beginning to learn what truth looked like in rooms without windows, fragile, distorted, and often ignored. The cell was silent, save for the hum of distant voices and the occasional metallic clank of doors locking elsewhere in the facility. Isolation, they had called it, for his protection. But to Isaiah, it felt more like being buried alive. No faces, no footsteps he recognized, just guards with hollow eyes and clockwork routines. The kind of silence that didn't offer peace, but amplified every doubt. He hadn't spoken more than a sentence in 3 days, and no one seemed to notice. Across town, in the modest back office of a retired judge's home, Thomas Carter was pacing. Files were spread across the desk like puzzle pieces, documents with yellowed edges and smeared ink, testimonies that had long since been forgotten. Judge Allen Monroe, once a respected figure in the military court system, had met Thomas after his discharge years ago. Now, old and slower but still sharp, he leaned over the mess of paperwork, squinting through glasses perched low on his nose. Thomas had come with a desperate request: find something that could stall Judge Hallwell, even for a day. The two had pored over case histories deep into the evening, digging into Hallwell's records, searching for a crack in the concrete wall of his career. Then they found it. A case from 2 decades prior, obscure, redacted in places, and buried under procedural clutter. A young black Navy officer's son, 17 at the time, had been accused of assault in a school altercation eerily similar to Isaiah's. Hallwell had handed down the maximum sentence, ignoring conflicting testimonies and circumstantial evidence. Years later, the ruling had been overturned by a federal appeals court citing judicial misconduct and racially biased language hidden in the sealed transcript. But the records were incomplete, pages missing, signatures faded. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was more like smoke without fire. Still, it was something. Thomas gripped the folder like it might disappear if he blinked. He knew it wouldn't reverse anything overnight, but maybe it could create doubt. Enough to halt the sentencing, to demand a closer look. Maybe even enough to make someone ask why so many of Hallwell's sentences leaned the same direction. He reached for his phone, dialing through to Isaiah's temporary counselor, demanding a call, even a minute of conversation. The line crackled before connecting, and in hushed tones, Thomas told his son to be strong. He couldn't make promises, but he told Isaiah to say what they'd discussed, even if it sounded strange, even if no one wanted to hear it. Speak the truth. Let it echo in that courtroom. Let it demand to be noticed. Back in his cell, Isaiah pressed the receiver of the wall phone to his ear, listening to the familiar cadence of his father's voice. Thomas didn't sound like the man Isaiah remembered from their family dinners, boisterous and commanding, but more like a soldier wounded in battle, clinging to orders in the fog. Isaiah nodded silently, committing every word to memory. The call was short, too short. The click of the disconnect echoed louder than the words themselves. But something inside him shifted. Isaiah sat back down, eyes once again finding the ceiling. His fingers traced the edge of the thin blanket on his bed, pulling it tight across his lap. He thought about the other boys he'd seen in court. Some younger, some older, all of them black or brown, all of them silent as the gavel fell. Their faces haunted him now, their eyes vacant, already gone long before the sentence was read. He didn't want to be another statistic, not because he thought himself better, but because someone had to break the cycle. He repeated the words to himself softly, not a rehearsed speech, not some legal defense crafted in a boardroom, but a truth forged in the fire of everything he'd endured. He whispered them until they became familiar, until they belonged to him. He thought about Malik, about the last time they talked, about the way his cousin had smiled and said he was proud. Malik wouldn't have folded, neither would his dad, and neither would he. That night, Isaiah didn't sleep. He sat upright on the edge of his bed, every muscle alert, every thought sharp. The shadows from the hallway light danced on the wall, moving slowly as if the building itself breathed with him. The minutes dragged, each one feeling like an hour. He kept thinking about that courtroom, the heavy wooden bench, the way Judge Hallwell never looked him in the eye, the way the bailiff always stood too close, the way the room got colder each time he spoke. But when the moment came, when the cell door creaked open just before sunrise and the guard called his name, Isaiah stood tall. His heart thudded, steady and strong. He didn't know what would happen, didn't know if the court would care, but the words were ready. His voice, though scarred by silence and shame, wasn't broken. It never had been. He walked the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, steel chains clinking softly around his ankles. Other inmates watched from behind thick glass, some with pity, some with resignation. Isaiah didn't meet their eyes, but he felt their presence like a tide pushing him forward. One more boy walking into a courtroom that had seen too many just like him. But this time he wouldn't be invisible. Not today. And maybe, just maybe, if he spoke loud enough, clear enough, true enough, he could pierce through the silence that had smothered so many before him. Maybe someone would listen. Maybe someone would see. That fragile hope clung to him like armor. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the war he was fighting, that was enough. The courtroom was full, yet silent. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that stretched time itself. Reporters lined the back rows, pens poised like weapons, waiting for words that could bleed across headlines. Some tapped their phones nervously, others whispered speculations too quietly to hear. The faint whir of a ceiling fan buzzed overhead, offering no relief from the tension crawling along the walls. On the defense side, Isaiah Carter sat, bound at the wrists and ankles, the cold bite of steel more humiliating than painful. He kept his eyes lowered, not out of guilt, but to shield himself from the glares, the judgments, the assumptions that wrapped around him like a noose. Beside him, his public defender gripped a manila folder with trembling fingers. His notes, disorganized and barely legible, betrayed a man unprepared and overwhelmed. Sweat beaded along his forehead, and he kept glancing at the judge's bench, like a man waiting for a guillotine to drop. No preparation. No defense strategy that could undo the prosecutor's narrative, which had already been seared into the minds of everyone in the room. Judge Richard Hallwell presided with his usual frost. His eyes scanned the room without emotion, resting finally on Isaiah with the same look one might give a misbehaving stray. His gavel rested at the edge of his bench, untouched, unnecessary, his authority never questioned. He called the room to order, voice steady, stripped of empathy, as if this were just another routine task on an endless docket of disposable lives. Isaiah didn't expect compassion. He hadn't seen it since his arrest. The prosecutor stood with calm arrogance, suit crisp, voice sharp. He wove a story, not built on evidence but on assumption and fear. He described Isaiah as a repeat offender, a boy who'd become a man too quickly and made all the wrong choices. He mentioned the robbery with confidence, leaning on the vague witness statement and the grainy footage that didn't actually show Isaiah committing anything, just standing there, once, days before. That was enough for the story they wanted to tell. He paced as he spoke, letting his voice rise in controlled bursts, feigning concern for the community while dripping venom. "This boy is exactly why our streets are dangerous," he declared, every syllable carefully designed to trigger fear. And no one objected. Not the public defender who seemed paralyzed, not the judge who nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The courtroom absorbed the lie like it had 1,000 times before. Isaiah sat unmoving. Not because he wasn't feeling anything, but because he was feeling everything. His insides roared while his exterior stayed still. He replayed the moment at school when cold hands cuffed him in front of classmates. He thought of Malik asking where he'd gone. He remembered the nights in holding, the silence, the voices trying to pressure a confession out of him. And he remembered his father's voice the night before, low and firm, urging him to speak, not to beg, not to defend, but to disrupt. He lifted his head slowly, just once. His eyes found Thomas Carter at the back of the courtroom. Thomas sat rigid, his navy posture unshaken, but his eyes were molten steel. A quiet promise passed between them, unspoken but unbreakable. Isaiah nodded barely. It was time. Judge Hallwell leaned forward, voice clipped and cold. "Isaiah Carter," he began, eyes narrowing slightly. "Before I issue my ruling, do you have anything to say for yourself?" The silence that followed was a vacuum. The judge's words echoed faintly, swallowed by the stillness. Isaiah rose, the chains around his limbs jangling softly, the sound sharp against the quiet. He stood taller than expected, his frame lean but steady, shaped by struggle. He scanned the courtroom, not for support, but to look each face in the eye, everyone that had already sentenced him. He cleared his throat, the only sign of nerves. Then he spoke. 2 words, deliberate, powerful, a lightning strike in the middle of a dry storm. "Look deeper." The effect was immediate and seismic. The courtroom flinched, as though the words carried physical weight. Judge Hallwell blinked, caught off guard. The clerk's pen froze mid-stroke. Even the prosecutor, polished and proud, lost his smirk for the first time. It wasn't just what Isaiah said, it was how he said it, calm, controlled, as if he wasn't asking, he was daring them, demanding. Thomas Carter's mouth tightened. He recognized it, the tone, the resolve, not defiance, but defiance's quieter, more dangerous cousin, conviction. Isaiah wasn't pleading. He was challenging the room to see past the frame they'd been handed. The silence grew uncomfortable. Hallwell shifted in his seat, a twitch betraying his stoic exterior. "Is that all?" he asked, voice now carrying a sliver of something new, uncertainty. Isaiah didn't answer. He sat back down, gaze steady. His words hovered like smoke, refusing to be cleared. Look deeper, into the case, the evidence, the judge's record, into a boy who had once wanted to be a lawyer, but now stood on the edge of being swallowed by a system he once believed in. Reporters began scribbling again, but now with urgency. Murmurs rippled from the gallery. A retired judge in attendance narrowed his eyes, recalling a name, a case, a pattern. And Thomas leaned forward slightly, knowing that somehow, against all odds, a crack had just formed in a wall long thought impenetrable. Judge Hallwell tapped his gavel once, more to regain control than to proceed. But the control was slipping. Those 2 words wouldn't leave the room. Not today. Not for a long time. Isaiah had done something no one expected. He'd spoken, and in doing so, he'd forced everyone to listen. What came next was uncertain. The ruling was still to come. But a boy in chains had turned a sentencing into a spotlight, and now, finally, the cracks were beginning to show. The 2 words weren't shouted, they weren't defiant, but they were exactly the words the judge hadn't expected, and couldn't ignore. "Yes, sir." It was the voice, the inflection, the calm and measured cadence. It didn't belong in a courtroom filled with tension and posturing. It didn't match the fear Judge Hallwell had grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of black boys accused of crimes they insisted they didn't commit. This wasn't fear. It wasn't resignation either. There was something deeper in the way Isaiah Carter answered. Something familiar. For a second, just a second, Hallwell wasn't in that courtroom anymore. He was 25 years younger, staring across a different courtroom, one with older wood, more cigarette smoke, and no cameras. A different boy had stood there, back straight, jaw clenched, trying not to cry while his father, a Navy officer in uniform, stood just behind the defense table. That man had pleaded not with anger, but with a heartbreaking dignity. Calm, intelligent, articulate. words sharpened by years of service, softened by a father's love. A black man asking the court not for pity, but for truth. Hallwell had denied the motion, denied the bail, denied the truth. The evidence had been thin, the witnesses shaky, but there had been pressure, backroom whispers, political favors, the usual promises of a quiet promotion if he just did what was expected. So he did. He'd sentenced the boy to 5 years. The appeal court overturned the ruling 17 months later after a civil rights attorney dug deep enough to uncover what Hallwell already knew. The case had holes. But by then, the boy had already been beaten in a juvenile facility, already lost a kidney, already missed his high school graduation, and the officer, his father, never returned to the courtroom. He retired quietly and disappeared from the judge's radar, taking with him the final words he'd spoken to Hallwell after the verdict. "You'll see my son again one day. Not like this." The memory slammed into the present with violent clarity. Hallwell stared at Isaiah, who stood as still as a statue. Same calm composure, same look in the eye. Not fear, certainty. But it was the voice that did it. It was like hearing a ghost. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" Hallwell asked. But the courtroom barely registered the question. It had come out quieter than intended, more like a breath than a challenge. Isaiah didn't flinch, didn't blink. "From my father, Thomas Carter." The name hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. It didn't need to be shouted. It detonated all the same. Hallwell's skin paled. His jaw twitched. His hand trembled slightly as it reached for the bench, steadying himself before he fell into a memory he had tried to bury with time and distance. Thomas Carter. The same man. The same father. The same case. And now, the son. Standing in the exact spot where injustice had taken root decades earlier. Hallwell whispered something to the clerk. A name, a file request, maybe just a command to breathe. No one heard it clearly, but the woman nodded and stood, walking briskly out of the room with a file pad in hand. The courtroom waited, unaware of the seismic shift taking place behind the judge's expression. Attorneys whispered to each other. Reporters scribbled notes. The bailiff shifted uneasily. But Isaiah stood completely still, eyes fixed on the judge, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as a mirror. A reflection of a decision long made and long regretted. The judge leaned back in his chair, breathing slow and heavy, as if oxygen had suddenly become a luxury. In the gallery, someone coughed. A reporter's pen tapped nervously on her notepad. One of the jurors glanced sideways at a fellow panelist, unsure whether they'd just witnessed something significant or merely strange. But it was the court stenographer, a quiet woman with 20 years behind that desk, who paused typing for the first time that morning. She felt it too, that stillness in the air, the hush that meant more than silence. Something had cracked. Isaiah didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His presence had already done what arguments and protests often failed to do, make the system pause. Not from outrage, but from recognition. Hallwell, for all his flaws, had a sharp memory, and guilt had a way of staining even the strongest mind. The past had caught up with him, not in the form of a newspaper headline or a protest chant, but in the voice of a young man who was supposed to be broken, and wasn't. The prosecution began to shuffle papers, eager to move forward. The lead attorney, a man who had built his reputation on conviction rates, leaned over and whispered to the assistant DA. "Something's wrong with the judge," he muttered. "He looks like he's seen a ghost." The defense attorney, who had only met Isaiah 3 weeks earlier, watched in stunned silence. He had prepped Isaiah for cross-examination, drilled him on responses, warned him of traps. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the judge to break character, and he certainly hadn't expected the defendant's voice to unravel decades of buried guilt. The clerk returned. In her hand was an old file. Paper, not digital, yellowed edges, the kind that predated the court's new system. She set it gently on Hallwell's bench and stepped back. He didn't open it right away. His fingers hovered above it, hesitant. The file was labeled in faded black ink. Carter, Thomas. Case number 98-213. He opened it slowly, the sound of aged paper filling the courtroom like whispers from another time. The photographs were still inside. A younger Hallwell stared back at him from the page, face harder, jaw clenched, eyes colder, a mugshot of the boy, medical records, statements, and then, folded neatly in the back pocket, the handwritten plea from the Navy officer. A letter never read aloud in court, marked, "For the judge's consideration." Hallwell had never opened it, until now. He read in silence, line by line. His eyes scanned the words, but his face betrayed the toll each sentence took. And Isaiah watched. He could see it happening, the unraveling, the reckoning. Isaiah didn't move. His stillness wasn't passive, it was purposeful. A lesson his father had taught him early on, that dignity isn't silence, it's presence. That there's a kind of strength in refusing to match the chaos around you. That sometimes, just being, just standing, forces the truth out of hiding. When Hallwell finally looked up, he didn't see a boy on trial. He saw the son of a man he'd wronged, the continuation of a legacy that refused to disappear. And it wasn't just guilt haunting him. It was the realization that the system he thought he controlled had kept receipts. Receipts in the form of sons who remembered. Sons who walked into courtrooms not to rage, but to remind. The room remained quiet. No one dared speak. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he closed the file and looked at Isaiah once more. There was no denial in his expression now. Only recognition. The moment had passed, but something fundamental had changed. It wasn't in the transcripts or the evidence lists or the procedural rules. It was in the air, in the weight pressing down on the old oak bench, in the eyes of a judge who'd just come face to face with the cost of his decisions, and in the silence of a boy who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Judge Hallwell recessed the courtroom for 10 minutes. It was a quiet declaration, but its impact rippled through the room like a sudden gust of cold air. Lawyers blinked, unsure of the shift. Reporters looked up from their notepads. Jurors straightened in their chairs, exchanging confused glances. Isaiah didn't move. He simply lowered his gaze, took a breath, and waited. Inside his chambers, Hallwell moved with the caution of a man walking through the wreckage of his own past. The walls, once adorned with plaques of judicial merit and honorary commendations, now seemed to close in. The air was heavier here, away from the court's performative space. His desk was cluttered, not with today's docket, but with the ghosts he had long since tried to file away. At the center of it all sat a single manila folder, its tab faded and frayed. The label, typed on an old mechanical typewriter, read, Carter T., 1998. He didn't open it. Not yet. His fingers hovered over the cover, trembling just slightly, as if the paper itself carried the weight of what he had refused to face for decades. The name had followed him ever since Isaiah spoke it. Thomas Carter. It rang through his conscience like the toll of a church bell in a quiet town, steady, undeniable, and echoing far past its final note. Thomas had stood in his courtroom once, not as a defendant but as a father, disciplined, proud, composed in a way that dared the room to reduce him to anything less. Hallwell remembered how the man's uniform was perfectly pressed, how his voice never cracked even when pleading for his son. He remembered the ache that came with denying him. He had chalked it up to duty, to precedent, to the pressures of politics and the brittle scaffolding of judicial decorum. But that had been a lie, a comforting one perhaps, but a lie all the same. Now, the son stood before him, younger but cut from the same cloth, the same fire, tempered with patience, the same strength without aggression, and Hallwell had almost done it again, almost stepped into the same trap of assuming, of dismissing, of failing. Only this time, it wasn't a nameless face or a forgettable trial. This time, the ghosts had come wearing the same eyes as the past. The 10 minutes passed like hours. He sat in the silence, eyes fixed on the unopened file. Around him, the clock ticked audibly, as if mocking the time he had wasted. His gavel, polished and symbolic, sat untouched on the shelf. A judge's power wasn't in the wood he struck, but in the silence he allowed to persist. And that silence was loud now. In the courtroom, Isaiah remained seated, still shackled, still unbending. His father was seated behind him, not in the row of concerned family members, but slightly off to the side, like a sentry, quiet, but vigilant. Thomas Carter hadn't aged so much as he had settled. The fire was still there, but now it smoldered beneath a layer of steady resolve. He didn't lean forward or tap his foot. He simply watched. Occasionally, his eyes met his son's, and when they did, a silent exchange passed between them, a quiet assurance that whatever happened next, they would face it as they always had, together. The court doors opened again, and Judge Hallwell stepped back into the room. But this time he moved differently, slower, not from weakness, but from the careful intention of a man aware of his every step. There was no trace of the usual pretense he wore like armor, no performative authority, no sweeping glance to reassert control. Instead, his eyes moved straight to Isaiah, then to Thomas, and then to the floor, where he allowed himself one small moment of stillness before climbing the bench. He took his seat, but he didn't lift the file or speak immediately. His gaze swept across the room, landing not on the attorneys or the jury, but on the young man before him, the one who had forced the truth to resurface without ever raising his voice. There was something in Hallwell's face now that hadn't been there before. Not pity, not guilt alone. It was closer to humility, uncomfortable but honest. He didn't reach for the sentencing statement. Instead, his voice broke the quiet with an unexpected question, directed not to the prosecution or to the jury, but to the defense. He asked whether there was any supplemental evidence or documentation from the family that the court had not yet reviewed. His voice was low, but it carried clearly through the courtroom, slicing through the stillness. The public defender froze. She hadn't prepared for this moment. She looked down at her brief, then up at Isaiah, confused. There was no supplemental evidence in their packet, not officially. She glanced toward Thomas Carter, as if waiting for a cue she hadn't anticipated needing. Thomas stood slowly, and with the dignity of a man who had waited years for this crack in the wall, stepped forward. In his hands were documents, not just files, but pieces of a history that connected the past and present like links in a chain. He approached the bench, not brashly, but with quiet certainty. The bailiff instinctively moved to block him, but Judge Hallwell raised a hand to stop it. Let him pass. Thomas laid the documents gently on the clerk's table. They weren't in legal brief format or typed for court. They were personal. Handwritten letters, copies of the original case notes, sworn statements from those who had witnessed the first injustice, photos of the injuries Isaiah's uncle had sustained in juvenile lockup after being wrongfully convicted. But most importantly, there was a timeline, a painful, meticulous reconstruction of how the same courtroom, under the same judge, had once failed a different boy with the same blood, and near the top of the stack, clipped with a rusted paper fastener, was Isaiah's own file. Spotless school records, teacher recommendations, church service documentation, and a sealed document signed by a Navy admiral attesting to Thomas's unblemished military history and his role in exposing corruption within a juvenile facility 2 decades earlier. The courtroom held its breath as Hallwell examined the first page. His eyes moved slowly, and for the second time that day, something shifted behind them. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was paper, ink, evidence, no longer deniable. This wasn't just a father pleading for mercy. This was a record, a reckoning. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The documents said everything. The failure, the continuity, the resilience. Isaiah remained still, his expression unchanged, not hopeful, not bitter, just present, just ready. And Hallwell, now surrounded by facts he could no longer push away, leaned back in his chair, the weight of history bearing down on him like the gavel he had lifted too quickly once before. He turned to the clerk, requested copies be made for both sides, and asked that the court recess again, not to delay but to review. It was no longer about optics or verdicts. It had become something far more dangerous for a man in his position: truth. In that brief recess, as the courtroom murmured and the jurors whispered quietly among themselves, something fundamental had changed. The judge who had always spoken with certainty now spoke with caution. The father who had once left this building with a broken heart now stood as a quiet force behind his son. And the boy, still shackled, still calm, sat with the stillness of someone who understood what it meant to carry legacy, not as a burden, but as armor. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When Judge Hallwell returned, he carried the documents with both hands, not just physically, but with the visible weight of everything they represented. He didn't look at Isaiah first this time. He looked at Thomas, and in that look, there was something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement, perhaps even an apology. The courtroom leaned forward. The next words could change everything. But for now, there was only silence. And in that silence, Isaiah sat steady, not because he trusted the system, but because he trusted his father. Trusted that the truth, once unearthed, couldn't be buried again. Not this time. The courtroom, once cold and cavernous, was now alive with a low hum of whispers. It began with a ripple, a slight murmur that spread across the gallery as Thomas Carter, unwavering in his composure, laid out the documents before the judge. His hands, strong and steady, moved with purpose, placing each page carefully, each one an undeniable testament to the truth he had carried for so long. The school reports were the first to be seen, each one a stark contrast to the criminal charges that had been leveled against Isaiah. There were letters of recommendation, the kind that typically came from those who saw promise, who believed in the young man's potential. Then there was the scholarship acceptance letter, one that proved Isaiah's future wasn't one of missteps or mistakes, but of academic promise, an opportunity that had nearly been stolen away by a wrongful accusation. And then, the document that shifted the ground beneath them all, the affidavit from the Navy judge. This wasn't just a letter, it was a direct link to the past that had been buried, ignored, and, in Hallwell's mind, forgotten. It was a link that tied Thomas Carter's name to the case Hallwell had once tried so hard to erase from his memory, the wrongful conviction, one that had never made the headlines but had stayed in Hallwell's mind, gnawing at him in the dead of night. The same conviction that had cost a man his dignity and a boy his future. The same boy now standing before him, only this time, his father was not pleading for mercy. He was demanding accountability. The pages, yellowed with age but sharp with truth, stared back at Hallwell as if daring him to deny them. It was undeniable. Hallwell's hands trembled slightly as he turned the final page. The words blurred for a moment, and he blinked hard, trying to focus. The weight of the history he had denied for so long pressed down on him, heavier now with each sentence he read. He was no longer a judge in a courtroom. He was a man standing at the edge of a reckoning, staring into the abyss of his own failures. His stomach churned, and he could almost hear the echoes of Thomas's voice from all those years ago. The same quiet defiance that had resonated in the young man's words just moments earlier. This wasn't just a case of a boy wrongly accused. It was the case of a man, of a father, whose legacy had been twisted by the same system that now sought to undo his son. And Hallwell had almost been complicit in it. Almost. The gavel, when it came down, didn't strike with the authority it once did. There was no finality in it, no force behind it. It wasn't the sound of justice being served. It was the sound of something softer, something far more fragile. Regret. The court fell silent as Hallwell set the gavel down, his hand lingering on the wood for a moment longer than was customary. He looked around the room, his eyes heavy with the burden of what he had just read, and his voice came out quieter than it had been all day. "This case," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The words came slowly, as if he were grappling with the weight of them. "This case has reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten, something I now regret." His eyes flicked briefly to Isaiah, then back to the papers. "I see not a criminal, but a son, a student, a young man caught in a system too quick to label and too slow to listen." The words hung in the air, each one a silent confession to the room, to the father who had stood here so many years ago, and to the son who was now standing in his shadow. There was no fury in his tone, no righteousness, just the quiet acknowledgement of a mistake long buried and now unearthed. Hallwell swallowed, his throat dry, and turned his gaze once again to Isaiah. The boy, no, the young man, stood there, his shoulders straight, his expression calm but not without the weight of everything that had come before. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't celebrating, he wasn't even relieved, not yet. But there was something there, something that Hallwell recognized. It was dignity, it was strength. It was the same quiet defiance that had once been in his own courtroom, spoken by a man whose voice now echoed through the years. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was less a proclamation of justice than an act of restraint. It wasn't the final strike of condemnation. but the soft, measured fall of a judge who had found something rare in his line of work: humility. "Case dismissed," Halwell said, the words reverberating through the room with a finality that felt like the breaking of a dam. Isaiah's knees buckled as the weight of the moment hit him. His heart raced, and for the briefest of seconds, he thought he might collapse. But before he could, Thomas Carter was there, swift and sure, breaking the invisible boundary of courtroom protocol, rushing forward to catch his son. It wasn't a moment for decorum. It wasn't a moment for rules. It was a father's instinct, an instinct honed over years of watching and waiting, protecting and providing. He wrapped his arms around Isaiah, pulling him close, not caring who was watching, not caring about the formalities that had governed this space until now. The sound of the embrace wasn't loud, but it was felt by everyone in the room. The silence that followed was thick with emotion, a silence filled with unspoken relief, the kind that comes after years of injustice, years of waiting for the truth to emerge. The courtroom was still and heavy, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The whispers began, low and uncertain at first, but soon they swelled into a murmur that spread throughout the gallery. The case had been dismissed, but the echoes of it would remain long after the gavel had fallen. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been resurrected. Not through the typical channels, not through the expected motions, but through something far more personal. It had been restored by a father's love, by a son's dignity, and by a judge who had finally found the courage to face the truth he had long denied. As Isaiah and his father stood there, wrapped in the quiet embrace of an impossible victory, the room around them seemed to fall away. The world outside could wait. For once, the courtroom wasn't a place of law or procedure. It was a place of redemption, of reconciliation. The system had failed them both, but now, in this moment, they were whole again. And for the first time in a long time, Isaiah felt something he hadn't in ages: hope. Word of the courtroom reversal spread like wildfire, igniting conversations and stirring emotions in every corner of the city. News outlets that once plastered Isaiah Carter's mugshot across their front pages now ran stories with headlines that seemed too good to be true. Wrongly accused teen walks free after historic turn in court. The narrative, once damning and definitive, had flipped. Isaiah, once labeled a troublemaker, was now seen as the embodiment of grace under fire, the victim of a broken system. And yet the damage lingered. It clung to him like a shadow, unshakable and persistent. At school, the whispers didn't stop. Some classmates approached him with hesitant apologies, their voices quiet and unsure, as if the weight of their own guilt hovered just beneath the surface. Others avoided him entirely, sidestepping the once familiar spaces where they had passed him by in the hallways, unsure how to treat the boy who had become the focus of their judgment and their shame. Isaiah, however, didn't seek pity. He didn't need it. He had never asked for sympathy, only for justice, for fairness. And now, as the dust of the trial began to settle, he found himself caught in the uncomfortable, albeit crucial space between his own redemption and the world's inability to forget what had happened. He knew the scars, both his and the community's, would take time to heal. They wouldn't disappear with a single news cycle. But he also understood something far deeper than the people around him could comprehend. Real change wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making sure it didn't repeat itself. So he chose to move forward, not with bitterness, but with resolve. With his father by his side, Isaiah threw himself into the work of progress. They began attending community forums, speaking out about the corruption of the judicial system and the flawed perceptions that had nearly destroyed their lives. At youth centers, Isaiah shared his story, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. He spoke about systemic racism, about the ways young black men were still seen as threats, even when they had done nothing to deserve it. He didn't rage against the world. Instead, he focused on the need for reform, the necessity of confronting these issues head-on, not with anger, but with a quiet, unrelenting determination. He knew that if he didn't speak, others would suffer the same fate he had. The weight of that responsibility never left him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose that grounded him when the pressure from the past seemed almost unbearable. Every time he walked into a room to speak, he was reminded that there were people out there who needed to hear him, who needed to see that someone could survive this kind of injustice and still stand tall. And so he did. He stood tall for them, for all of them. Meanwhile, Judge Hallwell found himself facing a different kind of storm. The world of law, once a comfortable space of power and certainty, was now a landscape of sharp scrutiny and self-doubt. Behind closed doors, the legal community began questioning his judgment. Ethics committees, once hesitant to challenge a judge of his stature, now quietly initiated reviews of his previous rulings. The system that had protected him for so long was now turning its back on him, exposing his flaws for all to see. For the first time in years, Hallwell wasn't certain of his place in the world. He had been so sure of himself before, so confident that his authority was unquestionable. But now, as his every decision was re-examined under a microscope, he began to question whether he belonged on the bench at all. The weight of his past mistakes bore down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But instead of retreating into the pride that had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions, Judge Hallwell chose a different path. He couldn't erase what he had done, but he could face it. He could be accountable. And so, in a rare moment of humility, he decided to do something he had never done before. He visited a law school guest lecture, unannounced and without fanfare. He stood in front of a group of students, not as a judge but as a man who had made a grave error, a man who needed to be held accountable for the harm he had caused. There were no excuses, no justifications. He didn't hide behind his status or his years of service. Instead, he simply told them the truth. He told them what he had done and the damage it had caused. He didn't offer them any comfort or relief. He offered them only honesty. "Don't ever assume guilt by skin," he told them. "I did, and I almost destroyed a family, twice." His words didn't absolve him of his actions, but they marked the beginning of something rare in the world of law: accountability. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was a first step toward acknowledging it. A first step toward repairing the damage, even if it took years. For the first time, Judge Hallwell understood the true cost of his judgments. He understood that the law, in its pursuit of fairness, could sometimes perpetuate the very injustices it was meant to correct. And that realization, though painful, was the start of his own personal reckoning. As Isaiah continued to work for change, as he shared his story with anyone who would listen, he found himself in a new battle, not with the system that had wronged him, but with the persistent weight of public opinion. There were those who still clung to the old narrative, who refused to see him as anything other than a criminal. The world was never quick to forget, and yet, every step he took toward creating change, every time he stood in front of a crowd to speak, he could feel something shifting. Slowly, but steadily, the tide began to turn. People were beginning to listen, not just to the words he spoke, but to the man he had become. A man who had survived the unimaginable and who now fought not for himself, but for everyone who would come after him. The scars, however, remained. They would always remain. But Isaiah no longer saw them as reminders of his suffering. Instead, he saw them as a symbol of his strength, of his ability to rise above the worst the world had thrown at him. And with that strength, he continued to push forward. He didn't need the world to forget the past. He needed it to learn from it. He needed it to change. And with each day that passed, he felt a little closer to that goal. Months had passed since the courtroom, but Isaiah's journey felt as though it had only just begun. It was a clear spring afternoon when he stood before a group of high school students in a community hall, the air fresh with the scent of new life, yet still carrying a weight from all that had come before. The room was packed, an anxious mix of parents and teenagers, their faces familiar yet strange in this new reality. Isaiah was no longer the boy accused of a crime he didn't commit, but a young man who had faced the storm and come out on the other side with a voice that demanded to be heard. His posture was different now, not as a victim, but as a person who had reclaimed his narrative, whose story no longer belonged to the court or the media. He wasn't standing in front of them for pity. He was standing there to speak truth, to speak of what had been lost and what had been gained. He wore a simple shirt and blazer, a far cry from the ragged, handcuffed image the world had once seen. Yet in his eyes, there was something even more powerful than the polished exterior of a young man who had weathered the storm. There was the quiet strength of a person who had been broken and had rebuilt himself. As he spoke, his voice held none of the uncertainty it once might have. This was no longer a boy in a courtroom trying to convince a judge of his innocence. This was Isaiah Carter, standing with the kind of quiet resolve that commanded attention. The words he shared were not just about what had happened to him, but about the weight of those months of waiting, the slow grind of seeing the truth come to light, the toll it took to remain whole while the world tried to reduce him to a stereotype. "I didn't beat the system," he began, his voice steady, but filled with a depth that drew the room in. The words fell from his lips with an unspoken truth in them, something that made even the air feel heavier. The truth did. The weight of those words landed in the room, echoing like the softest of thunder, resonating with a quiet power that belied their simplicity. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him, as though he could see beyond them, into the quiet places where his own pain had once lived. "But it took everything I had," he continued, his voice softening, almost vulnerable, "not to lose myself while waiting for the world to see it." It was a truth that spoke to more than just his story. It spoke to every person who had ever been silenced, misjudged, or overlooked. His words were a quiet anthem for those who had been forced to wait for their own truths to be recognized. For a moment, the weight of his experience seemed to fill the room, as if all the injustices of the world had coalesced in that single sentence. His story was no longer just about one boy in a courtroom. It was about every person who had been trapped in the waiting game, uncertain whether they would ever be seen for who they truly were. When he ended his speech, it was with the same two words that had stunned the courtroom months ago, words that, in the end, had transcended the fear and doubt that had plagued him for so long, words that meant more now than they ever had before. "Yes, sir." The two words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of the man he had become, of the strength he had discovered in the face of everything that had tried to break him. Behind him, his father, Thomas Carter, stood with quiet pride. Thomas had spent a lifetime fighting injustice, but he had always fought in silence, in the background, a shadow to his son's journey. He had never asked for recognition, never sought applause for the countless battles he'd fought. But now, watching Isaiah speak with a strength louder than any courtroom verdict, Thomas saw something in his son that went beyond the young man who had once been the subject of the nation's attention. He saw a legacy, not of suffering, but of resilience, of transformation. Isaiah had turned his pain into power, his silence into speech, and in doing so, he had become something Thomas had never thought he could be, an inspiration. At the back of the hall, seated quietly in civilian clothes, Judge Hallwell watched the proceedings. He did not rise or speak, his presence almost unnoticed by most in the room. His years of power and authority had come to an end, but he was still there, an observer to the change he had inadvertently set in motion. As the applause rang through the hall, loud and overwhelming, Hallwell's eyes glistened with something that went beyond regret. There was regret, yes, an understanding of the harm he had caused, the lives he had altered with a decision born of ignorance and prejudice. But there was something else in his gaze as well, something far more human: admiration. Isaiah had done what no verdict, no gavel, no ruling could ever accomplish. He had made an impact not with the weight of the law behind him, but with the power of his own voice. He had spoken not from a place of vengeance, but from a place of dignity. And in that moment, Judge Hallwell understood that it wasn't the judges or the lawyers or the system that shaped the future. It was the people, the individuals who had the strength to stand up, to speak out, and to change the world with nothing more than the truth in their hearts. He hadn't needed to be a judge to see it. Isaiah had shown him that. The applause that echoed through the room was more than just appreciation for a speech. It was a recognition of a movement, a shift that had been set into motion not by any court decision, but by the quiet power of a young man who refused to let his story be dictated by the world's expectations. Isaiah Carter had become more than a victim of circumstance. He had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the power of truth. And as the crowd continued to clap, as the room filled with a sense of something greater than just an individual victory, a new understanding began to take root in the quiet corners of the nation. For the first time, young boys who looked like Isaiah, young boys who had long been told they didn't matter, now believed that they had a chance. They believed their voices could be heard, that their stories could matter, that they too had the power to turn the tide, to reshape a system that had so often been stacked against them. And in the heart of it all stood Isaiah Carter, not just as a boy who had been wronged, but as a man who had created the change he had once only dreamed of. As the applause began to die down, Isaiah stood still, the weight of the moment settling on him. His father, now at his side, placed a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment they didn't need words. The truth, and everything it had brought with it, had already spoken for them both.